Hello and welcome back to The Effect. So in this video we're going to be talking about power analysis, something that is maybe a little bit underappreciated. And we're also going to be talking about how we can perform power analysis using simulation. So what is power analysis? So power analysis is all about whether we have enough firepower in the form of observations and sample size to be able to do the thing that we actually want to do. Statistics is not magical. It is bad at some things, or at least some things make it harder for statistics to do its job well. It's really hard to use statistics to find really tiny effects. If you want to know if having a parachute is going to save your life if you jump out of a plane, you could probably figure that out with maybe 1 or 2 observations. That'd be pretty easy to do. But if you want to know if a pill will make your hair grow by a fraction of a centimeter longer, well, you'd need a lot of observations to be able to do that. Tiny effects are simply very difficult to spot. You need a lot of observations to be able to figure them out. It's also very hard for statistics to work well if you don't have a lot of variation to work with. Statistics is all about studying variation. If there isn't any variation, then there's nothing you can really figure out about it. If you want to know if, for example, going to the moon makes you smarter, well, we've only had a couple people go to the moon, and so there's just not a lot of variation in that treatment. We have nothing really to study there, at least not with statistics. It's also very hard to figure things out if there's a lot of noise in the sample, if there's a lot of noise relative to the signal that you are looking at. If I want to know if, for example, the kind of pencil that you use has an effect on how well you do on an exam, let's say that in truth it does have an effect. Maybe a nicer pencil makes you do a little bit better, but also a lot of different stuff determines how well you do on an exam. And so even if there is truly an effect of the kind of pencil that you use, it will be hard to distinguish from all of the other stuff that's going on, and all the other stuff is going to make it hard to see the effect. Lastly, the higher standards that you have for evidence, the better all those things are going to be. If you just sort of want a general idea of how well that pencil works at improving your exam scores, then, a certain size sample might be okay. But if you want to be really, really precise about it, then you're going to need a much bigger sample. So those are all things that make statistics difficult to work well. So then we have the question, is it too hard? Are we in a setting where we simply don't have enough observations to be able to do what we want to do? Should we just take our ball and go home? And that is an important question to ask. You don't want to perform a study if you simply don't have the ability to estimate the thing that you want to estimate. Trying to perform a study with a sample size that is too small is a bad idea. Not only will you get very imprecise estimates, and there's a decent chance that you won't find an effect even if there is truly one there, but if you do find an effect, there's a decent chance that it's going to be just a fluke. If you're doing some sort of hypothesis testing, and you have a very tiny sample and you still manage to reject the null, that's pretty much only going to happen if you happen to get fluke data that's very, very weird. So it's a good idea going into it to know that you have enough sample size before you start to actually study the thing that you want. So that brings us to power analysis. And what power analysis does is it says we are going to take the setting that you are studying and we're going to figure out if you have enough sample size to study the thing that you want to study. Power analysis looks at 5 things. It looks at the true effect size. How big is the actual effect that you are trying to study? It looks at the variation in treatment. Do we have a lot of people who are treated and a lot of people who aren't treated? Do we have only a couple of people who are treated and mostly people who are not treated? Is there simply variation or not in that treatment effect? The more we see the treatment moving around, the easier it is to see whether it does anything. We look at the other variation in y, in the outcome variable, how much other stuff is going on other than the treatment we are looking at, right? This is all the other determinants of that test score other than your pencil. It looks at the statistical precision. How precise do we want our estimate to be? If there is truly an effect, do we want to reject the null hypothesis 80% of the time, 90% of the time? Do we want our standard errors to be a certain size or smaller? What is the level of statistical precision, the quality of evidence that we are shooting for? And then finally, the sample size. How much data do we have to work with? The way that power analysis works is that we will set 4 of those things constant, and it will tell us how big the other one needs to be. Typically, this means setting these 4 things constant and then asking ourselves, what is the minimum sample size that we need? How big does our sample have to be in order to hit that goal of statistical precision? How many observations do we need to get to have a standard error that is a certain size or smaller under a certain set of true effect sizes, variation in treatment, and how much other variation there is? Or perhaps we say, I know how big my sample size is going to be. How big does the effect need to be? How big does that true effect need to be for me to be able to detect it? If I only have 30 observations, then maybe I can only detect effect sizes that are in fact truly really big. But But if I have 1,000,000 observations, I can detect smaller effects as well with decent levels of precision. So that is the goal of power analysis. We're going to pick 4 things, and we're going to ask ourselves, what is the minimum sample size that we need to be able to do what we want to do? Or if we have a fixed sample size, what is the smallest effect that we can truly pick up on? We could also look at these other 3 things, but these are the 2 most common ones to look at. Now, why might we want to do this whole procedure with a simulation? Simulation is a good tool for doing power analysis because it allows you to incorporate all the different features of your data generating process. There are calculators out there that will perform power analysis for you without having to do a simulation, but they will only do it in the sort of settings that they have thought about ahead of time. So if you're just doing like a randomized controlled experiment with 2 groups and you randomly assign to one group or another, in a very simple case like that, then yeah, a calculator will do it for you. But in observational data, where you want to incorporate some complex stuff like, the hierarchical structure of the data that you're getting, or, the complex ways in which the treatment is assigned, you're probably going to want to run a simulation. How can you do that? So many of the steps of running a power analysis simulation are very similar to the steps that we've done with other simulations, where we simply create data with whatever setting we have in place. So we say, hey, here's how I think the data is going to be generated. Here's the true effect size that I have picked. Here are the other variations in treatment. Here's the other variation in Y. How much noise I have to deal with. Once we've created our data, just like with a regular simulation, we will apply whatever estimation method we are planning to use, and then we will store our estimate. If we are looking at the statistical power, how often we will reject a false null, then we want to store whether or not we have rejected the null. So far, that is the exact same simulation process that we did before. We generate some true data, we apply an estimator, and then we do it a bunch of times, and we see the distribution of our estimates. How often do we reject that null? Or what is the distribution of our estimates across a bunch of different samples? Then we do the thing that is different about power analysis, which is that we take that whole iteration procedure that we just did, and we add another iteration on top of it. We do that exact same procedure that we just did, but this time we try different sample sizes, or we try different true effect sizes, and we see what changes about our simulation results. So for example, maybe I would generate some data in which the true effect of treatment is that changing the pencil that you have increases your test score by 5 points. And I would run that simulation. I would say, okay, if I have a sample size of 100 students and the true effect is that it raises your test score by 5 points, then I reject the null 70% of the time. Then I say, okay, great. Well, what if instead of that sample size, now I have 1,000 students? But it's still a 5-point increase. If I have 1,000 students, how often will I reject the null? What if I have 10,000 students? What if I have 100,000 students, right? And I will try these different sample sizes, and it will tell me what is my level of statistical power or my level of statistical precision at a given effect size. Or maybe I keep the sample size constant and try different effect sizes. So I'm going to try different simulations with different settings for the sample size or for the true effect size or whatever it is. This will tell me what my minimum detectable effect size is, or what the minimum necessary sample size is. Because I can try a bunch of different sample sizes or a bunch of different effect sizes, and I can see which ones give me a reasonable level of statistical precision or statistical power. And that's it, right? We just do our simulation from before, try it with a bunch of different settings, see which settings give us reasonable levels of statistical precision or statistical power. And this will tell us how many observations do we need to have. Or how big do we think the effect needs to be in order to have a decent chance of detecting it? And here's the kicker. If you don't get that, if it tells you that you need 100,000 students to estimate the effect of the pencil, but you only have access to 5,000, well, then you probably shouldn't do that study. It's not a good idea to do studies that are poorly powered. All right, that's how we can use simulation to perform a power analysis, also what power analysis is and why it's a good idea. That closes us out for the simulation chapter. As we move forward, we're going to start talking about some more specialized causal inference methodology. Hope I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.